All right, so today's panel discussion is titled The Climate for ClimateTech Investment, and Dawn is pulling double duty. She's taking a 30-second rest before I call her back up. So I'm gonna call each of the panelists up to come up and have a seat. I'd like to ask you to please enter that side of the stage and then take the furthest seat. So we have Ian Adams from Evergreen Climate Innovations. We have Alicia Lenis from Chrysalix. We have Thurston Cromwell from Emerson. We have Matt Harbaugh from Mountain State Capital and the U.S. Research Impact Alliance. We have, you may have seen her, Dawn James from Deloitte. And then lastly, we have Reed McManigle, who will be moderating today's discussion. So let's give a round of applause for this panel.
All right, here we go. Thank you all for coming. A number of you came from great distance, so we'll be hearing a little bit about that. So I'd like to start off by first having each of the panelists, other than Dawn, who's already introduced herself, just give a little bit of background about themselves and what fund they're with, and then I'm going to come back and ask about how their fund is different than the others on the panel. So let's just first start with just general introductions. Who are you? What do you do? Who are you with? Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, everybody. Matt Harbaugh. I think I'm the only local investor here. So I have two organizations that I'll probably talk about at some point here. One is my for-profit venture capital fund called Mountain State Capital. We launched it about 4 years ago. We've invested about $20 million in 25 companies in the last 4 years. The other one is a nonprofit, so it's reaching earlier into the cycle to try to pull technologies out of universities and national labs and get them to the point where they are investable for a for-profit fund. And that group is called the U.S. Research Impact Alliance. Is that good enough? All right.
Thurston Cromwell from Emerson. We're a process automation, now pure play company. Used to be, have a lot of presence in the climate area, but we have divested due to an announced partnership with Blackstone, our climate business, HVAC, refrigeration, things of that nature. So we are now a pure play industrial automation company. And I lead our venture arm, Emerson Ventures, where we focus on discrete automation solutions, industrial software, and relevant to this discussion, sustainability solutions.
Thank you, Thurston. Alicia?
Hi, everyone. Alicia Lenis with Chrysalix Venture Capital. So we're a seed stage venture capital firm focused on industrial innovation. So all of those industries that Dawn was talking about earlier. We're based out of Vancouver in the Netherlands and invest across North America, Western Europe.
Ian?
Good morning. Ian Adams with Evergreen Climate Innovations, based in Chicago. We're a pre-seed, seed stage investor, structures a nonprofit to address some of the challenges that Matt was just speaking to, bringing innovation to market. We invest early stage technologies in the climate space sort of across Pittsburgh to Denver region.
So I think one of the interesting things of this panel is the diversity of perspectives. We have a fund that's dedicated specifically to climate tech, operates North America and Europe. We have a regional fund that is sort of sector agnostic, but does work in energy. We have a corporate venture fund, which has an entirely different perspective on the kind of things. And we have Ian, who works in a nonprofit making investments. So I want to dive down into like, how do each of you view the world? And how do you think what you do is different than others on the panel? What sort of motivates you to do deals? You want to start at the far end then with Ian?
Sure. So yeah, we're a little bit odd. So being a nonprofit, we use philanthropic dollars to capitalize on our funds instead of having limited partners or other investors in that fund. So we are intending to serve as a bridge for early stage innovation for companies that are spinning out of labs and universities and are not at a point yet where they're ready to raise some more traditional institutional capital. And then we work with those companies to get them ready. So when things are going well, we can deposit one of these companies at the doorstep of a more traditional institutional investor as they're going out to raise their first institutional round and be a bridge to those investors.
So you're different in the sense that you're looking at earlier stage deals and also different in the source of your money and being able to be more patient.
Exactly. The source of our funds, the approach, and because they're nonprofit dollars, we have a more explicit impact lens. So if there's like a super hot deal that we're talking to, we're not necessarily the best investor for the hottest deal, which is like the opposite of most investors. So if someone's going to raise that money anyway, there's not like a reason for us to be there. And so they're better off staying in touch and being wished the best of luck from our perspective.
Thank you. Alicia, do you want to?
First off, we love catalytic capital because that feeds right into what we do. So we really kind of invest at that. Once a company is launched, we're the first check into the company from an institutional investor standpoint. What makes Chrysalix pretty unique is that we are one of the venture capital firms that has focused on or has been comfortable with investing in clean tech, climate tech for years. We've been in the business for 20 years and comfortable with not just software, but we truly believe that you need, atoms and molecules in order to kind of solve this problem that Don highlighted so well. And so we invest across the hardware space. Maybe one other point for us that is a bit different for us than many other VC firms as well is that the money that kind of we deploy, our investors are not just large pension funds and endowments, which is typically what you would find for venture capital. We have a specific model where we work with industrial corporates. We, for example, have investors who are large mining companies, automotive OEMs, machinery OEMs, utilities. And the idea behind that is for us as venture capitalists, we are looking to kind of really understand the markets that we're investing in, and having those kind of groups around the table with us creates this fantastic ecosystem and flow of information between them, ourselves, and the startups that we're working with.
Are you structured then in a typical 10-year cycle?
Yeah, everything else is kind of standard 10-year plus, extensions for a VC. Just this underlying fact that, we are deeply connected in the kind of industrial corporate world and seek to kind of facilitate, therefore, relationships with our startups, with those kind of partners that we have.
Can you tell us the size of your fund and typical check size?
Yeah, so we're seed funds, so that means that we kind of typically have funds that are 100 to 150 million for the total size of the funds. Our initial checks are 1 to 2 million approximately into a kind of up to 5 million round, and then we reserve follow-on investment.
Ian, I forgot to ask you typical check size.
Oh yeah, typical check size, 250,000, and we're usually investing in rounds that folks are raising somewhere between 500 and 3-4 million.
Thank you. Thurston, you want to tell us about Emerson?
Yeah. So at Emerson, unlike your funds, we have no LPs. We have one LP, which is Emerson Electric Company, and our approach is we are looking for technologies that we think at some point down the road will give us a great chance at delivering a better solution for a customer. So that's the premise behind every investment we make. Yes, we have a mandate to achieve typical financial VC-type returns of 25 to 35% on an annualized basis, on a portfolio basis. But at the end of the day, we are strategic investors looking to get that access to innovation that comes from partnering with, investing in, working side by side with early stage innovative technology companies.
Could you tell us a little bit more about check sizes and specific domains of interest?
Yeah, so we do all of our investing off the balance sheet, so don't have the need for a fund structure. But our typical, so whereas pre-seed and seed, we come in a little later. We need a company to have that traction, that commercialization, that product market fit that we need to see that they're of a size and scale and scope that they make a good partner for us and can handle what we may be thinking about on a channel partner OEM strategic basis. So our general check sizes are usually in that, the B round is usually our sweet spot, and our check sizes for our first investment are $3 to $5 million with a strong commitment for follow-on round.
And do you want to tell us a little bit more about Emerson and specific sectors that you operate in that you want to make investments in?
Yes. So Emerson is now a pure play process automation technology company. So our customers are some of the biggest energy companies around the world. Our power and water solutions business is based here in Pittsburgh. Used to be the old Westinghouse power business that we acquired in the 90s. So we have a massive presence in energy generation, electrical generation. I think we have about 60% of North American gigawatt production under our Ovation DCS system. Back in 2021, we acquired a company out of Minneapolis called OSI, and they do transmission and distribution SCADA software. So on that power side, we are from turbine to meter. And now we're looking at all of these trends as to how does the grid grow, how does it digitize, how do we partner with the assets that are behind the meter. So that's a big area of focus for us. We also look at renewable technologies, things that interconnect between renewables and the grid. We also are looking at certain technologies, more enabling technologies in the sustainability space around carbon capture, sequestration, and hydrogen.
Thank you. Matt, you're the only local or regional fund. You're the only generalist fund. Can you tell us how your perspective in this domain?
Yeah. And I straddle that. I've got one foot in the for-profit side and the other on the nonprofit side. So, yeah, our for-profit fund, Mountain State Capital, is something that one other partner and I started 4 years ago. We went out and raised the money for it from traditional limited partners and high net worth individuals. We've invested that over the last 4 years into generally technology, life sciences, and other types of sort of high-tech sectors. We do have a radius that we like to stay in with that fund, sort of a 6-hour drive from Pittsburgh. But, we'll go where we see the best opportunities. I got into the nonprofit side and sort of the energy-focused side almost, by accident. I had done some consulting at the National Energy Technology Lab here in the region, and really saw the difficulty on that side of commercializing energy-related technologies. And because I had also this for-profit fund, it kind of bothered me that given all of the strengths that we had here in the region around energy and materials and chemistry, that we weren't seeing a lot of startups that were coming to our seed fund, and our for-profit fund is a seed fund. We weren't seeing a lot of companies coming to us that were sort of at that investable stage. And it didn't seem like there was a very robust sort of support system here in the region to help move things from the lab and through that early commercialization process. And for better or worse, I decided to take that on as another challenge, and pulled some people together, and we put this nonprofit together, the U.S. Research Impact Alliance. The word impact is important there. It's all about not keeping the research in the labs, actually getting it to the point where it has a real impact. And then we applied for a grant from the Department of Energy. We got $1 million grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to start an accelerator program. We started that just last summer. We have our first cohort with 5 companies in it right now. They tend to be, I would say, more on that industrial side, and it's one of the reasons, Don, I was so interested in how you define those hard to abate areas, because I feel like as as time goes on and we're sort of finding our purpose on the nonprofit side, I think it's zeroing in on looking at those hard to abate sectors, because that also lines up with a lot of the research here in this region, and saying, how can we team up the researchers with very targeted industry input? We can go out, we can find the advisors from sectors here in the region, but with large companies all over the country. The DOE will actually pay, we use that money to pay individuals from those industry sectors to serve as advisors for the startups. And then in addition to that, we also focus on how can we help to subsidize their some of their early scale-up work. So we're not trying to be all things to all of those companies within that sector, but we're really just focusing on how do we make the match with some industry partners, how do we find the right labs or facilities to help them scale up to the next level, and then how do we find some money to help them do it. And I think if we can solve those issues, we're going to have more startups that get to the point where a private sector investor might be interested in investing in them.
Thank you, Matt. One of the themes that I'm starting to hear is various people here talking about the importance of having that industry pull to make investment decisions and to guide their client companies towards a financial business. So Dawn, you do a lot of consulting for the very large companies. How do you see the trends of market pull from these companies? Are there new opportunities coming through that are driving the investment trends that we're going to talk about next? But if you could give a perspective of the large companies that you're advising and how they're changing what they're doing internally, how they're changing what they're doing with small companies, and how that's creating market pull.
Yeah, I think that it's a kind of a multi-pronged answer, right? There's a lot of variables that are at play for how the market is changing, and what is that pull that is changing how companies, the large companies, are looking at their investment strategies. So I think, like, if I were to kind of say what is most important, number one is they're looking at the future and the resilience of their current business model, the core of what it is that they do. They're looking at being able to survive change, right? So I think that's the biggest thing. And so when you start looking at the elements of the winds of change, right, then that starts getting us down to the specifics of different sectors and what needs to change and what is causing that change. And so when we're focused on kind of green and clean tech or climate action, sustainability, what companies are looking at, number one, is that data piece, right? So they have to understand the elements of their own company, and that is a data issue. So there's a digital maturity piece to it. I see that kind of being one of the first things. So when they're looking at the digital maturity of their own company, sometimes they're looking for innovation in that space. Sometimes they're looking for big tech to come in and help. So when we, if I'm thinking about kind of the startup space or the innovation space, some of these, and I talked about that a little bit in the keynote around the software and the hardware that kind of comes into that, and looking at some of the innovation around that. And then depending on which sector we're talking about, if we're focused kind of like what Mike said on the hard to abate sectors, if we focus on that right now from a manufacturing, energy, or infrastructure standpoint, there's a lot of kind of spokes that come off of those sectors. So, I know Emerson very well, worked with you guys quite a bit in some of my former work, but so some of the companies like Emerson that do a lot of this kind of process predictive work. I worked with your software, some of your software services that you provide, and some of the innovation that's coming out of the companies like that are servicing the energy sector. So again, it comes down to data. It comes down to how you're able to transform that data to be able to gain insights. And then we're looking at assets, capital, and then being able to maneuver those organizations for what's coming next. So they're looking at what the government's doing. They're looking at global. A lot of these companies that I work with have a global footprint. So there's kind of a geopolitical aspect to it. And then kind of to Mike's point, which I think was really important that you mentioned, there's a workforce transformation that's happening at the same time. So how are we upskilling? How are we looking at the hard-to-abate sectors where the jobs will, kind of naturally need to transition? So if we look at like the mining sector or some of these like heavy industry sectors, and like I mentioned, some of the assets that will need to change. So some of the innovation that's coming out around the hardware, some of these big machines that are producing certain types of materials, how do we start transforming how the people who work or service those machines change into the next phase that's coming? What do we do with the engineers that are focused in the mining industry? How do we transition that? So we're seeing that from all of the different perspectives, depending on the company, depending on the sector, and they're looking at all of those variables, and then they're focusing investment, business model, and strategy towards that change.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to now hear each of the panelists sort of give their view of the world, what's going on in the investment world, and I'll give you a couple prompts and you can pick up any or all of these. So are you seeing more interest from investors coming into the field, your limited partners? Are there more funds wanting to co-invest with you? On the other side, are you seeing a bigger and better deal flow of companies? Are they more prepared? Are they solving bigger problems? So what are you seeing on both sides of your operations in terms of people you're co-investing with or you're getting money from, as well as the deals that you're saying? Thank you.
Well, so I want to answer this question, but I'm going to kind of tie it in a bit to the previous question because it's linked. So I think when we think of, we're industry connected, let's call it that. And what we've seen is a huge influx in CVCs, in dollars coming in focused on decarbonization. And where we think that comes from is that globally across kind of major corporates, there is a huge amount of companies that have pledged for their own company to hit a certain level of scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions, depending on the company, to be net zero by, and then they'd pick their year, 2050, maybe some might be 2040, et cetera. And if you were a bit pessimistic, what you would think is, okay, that's just what they're saying. But what we've also seen is that they're now putting actual capital dollars behind that and spinning up teams, even organizations in their team that are focused on climate tech and fully on climate tech and decarbonization. And that's exciting because that means that there is that market pull, that these companies are looking for solutions. In some cases, they might have some internal kind of departments that are working on things, but there is a lot that they don't have solved and they need to solve. So just tying up that. The other piece that just to really answer your question on what are we seeing on each end, it's astounding what has happened in the last 2 years. So I joined Chrysalix. So Chrysalix has been around since 2001. I joined in 2018. And in 2018, if we said we were into clean tech and climate tech and that's what we were doing, people kind of just walked kind of away and were like, oh, that's not the future. And today, in the last 2 years, 2021, 2022, for private kind of capital funds, $94 billion have gone into new private capital funds that have launched across the whole, from seed all the way to kind of growth and private equity funds. That is huge. So we're seeing a lot of people coming in. It's needed. It's welcome. It's fantastic. It makes me really excited for the potential in this space for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Alicia. Ian?
Yeah, I agree. Like Don was alluding to before, I too, you might be surprised to know, but I have never been cool until now, being in the climate tech space, and 5 years ago, totally different space. It matters, I think, a little bit on exactly what time frame you're talking about. This huge run-up in the last 5 years. 2021 was like a crazy year for venture in general, so everything was bubbly and elevated, and so what we saw in our 2022 data for funding, sort of early stage climate funding, there's a bit of a drawback there, but there was a drawback everywhere, and that was just like a really bonkers year. So I think there are more funds raised then and in early 22 than are raising now, but there's so many more funds. There's like lots of funds that I don't know. You know, I see people making investments like, oh, I don't know who those are. Like in 2019, you knew them all, and most of them, if you went to like a couple of events, you could like see them all at the same time around a couple tables, you know.
Thurston?
So from a slightly different perspective, the mega trend sort of in the corporate investing world has been the proliferation of the corporate investing world. I was with Alicia's colleague out at a conference in California last week, and it's the Global Corporate Venturing organization, sort of the main group for CVCs. And I'd first gone to that conference in 2017. And I think there were maybe 70 or 80. And this year, I would estimate 500. And you know, they put up a stat that 80% of the Fortune 500 now have a CVC arm. And 5-7 years ago, corporate venture had a bit of a taint to it. They were run by folks usually in the corporate development department, like myself, that you know, maybe have come to it with an expectation that, you're getting our money, what benefits are we getting? Or what right of first refusal do we have to acquire you? And had all of these very naive and immature views as to how the ecosystem works and why it works so well and why it's done so much for this country and technology companies. But I think as that ecosystem has matured and gained some perspective, and CVCs both work with financial VCs as well as other CVCs, the ecosystem is really starting to get a much different reputation. And right now, I think that corporate venture arms that have that agnostic view as to who they will partner with come into investments with zero expectations other than a belief that they can be a true value-add strategic investor is really elevating our opportunity to see some of the best deals and partner with the best companies. So that's a trend that has been nice to emerge. And people sometimes say, well, how on earth can you invest with competitors? And I say it's, we don't care. If there's a syndicate of strategic investors that include top-tier financial VCs, our customers, and our competitors, and we, by jointly deciding what a potential winner is in a technology space, we'd much prefer that than say, you go find your company that does X, we'll go find ours, and you go find yours, and then they'll all, fight each other, and somebody will win, and we have no idea who that'll be. So it took a little bit of explaining to my senior leadership that yes, we are investing with the Honeywells, Rockwells, and ABBs of the world, who are our big competitors, but it's thus far had a really good effect and resulting in good deal flow.
Thank you, Thurston. Matt, what kind of trends are you seeing?
So I'll take it from the perspective of someone who's been doing more generalist VC investing for 20-some years. Over time, in every technology sector and every industry sector, I think there's been a trend to specialization, and especially on the investment side. So I think the general clean tech, investment strategy was something that we did see a lot of 10 years ago, and I think that's getting more specialized, just like in put on my other hat back in my generalist fund, we do a lot of life science investing. There used to be a lot of generalist life science investors, and now they're specializing into pharma, med devices, diagnostics. When I look at the companies that we've invested in out of our seed fund, and you're not supposed to choose favorites among your children, but of course I do. I rank all of the companies in my fund constantly, and then I take the top tier, the top performers, and I say, what are the commonalities between these companies? I mean, they're in different sectors, but are there some themes? All the ones that are performing really well, not all, but 8 out of 10 of the top 10 companies in our portfolio went through a specialized, sector-specific accelerator program. So what does that tell me? That the nice thing is that there are programs out there to help technology entrepreneurs get out of the lab and start interacting with industry. There's a lot of very generalist accelerator programs where they're just going to teach you how to give a pitch and, be an entrepreneur in general. But the ones that really have results and really lead to strong performing startups are those where you're finding a program anywhere in the country where you look at the people behind that group, whether it's a fund or it's a nonprofit program. Do they have connections into the industry? Who are their connections? Do their connections line up with your target market? And if you can get into those types of accelerator programs, your chance of success increases tremendously. It makes it a lot easier for a generalist fund somewhere down the road to come in and invest if they already know that you've been working with a bunch of companies in your industry for a while, and you've probably got some very targeted, specialized money in there from an investor like these guys who really know the industry and have those connections. So I think the good news is things are getting more specialized from large funds all the way down to the accelerator programs. And if you can find a specialized accelerator program that fits what you're trying to do, you should try to get into that program.
Thank you all. So now I want to shift a little bit and follow up on some of the information that Don shared with us about the new federal money coming out. And how do you think that's changing the perspective of investors? What's investable and so on. And then the second part of this, talking about $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion coming through, I want to refer to a comment that somebody made yesterday where she said she bought a house that had an oversized air conditioning system and undersized ductwork. And she brought that up as a metaphor for her working in state government, is like, there's going to be so much coming at us and we don't have the staff to deal with it. So I'm thinking from a system perspective of accelerators and investors and corporate VCs and startup programs and universities, like, how are we going to deal with $1 trillion more coming through the pipeline in our small ductwork? So what are you seeing in terms of corporate responses to the federal money, and do you think we're ready for it? What do we need? What challenges? What missing pieces?
Well, so the first thing that came to my mind when you were talking, I was in New York yesterday and the day before. I was speaking at a solar investment conference, and I was sitting on a panel with some of the DOE folks that are part of the distributing the IRA money, and what they were talking about, just like you said, was the staff available to be able to handle the number of applications.
You need to hire like 1,000 more people.
Yeah, no, it's a big thing, and at CERA Week, I was having a conversation with Secretary Granholm, and she was, reflecting on the same thing about how many people she needs to hire, new directors, and actually new organizations within the DOE that needs to be stood up to be able to handle it. And same with the LPO office. They just got infused with that $400 trillion, right, that they need. $1 billion that they need to be able to distribute. And I don't know if anybody's ever gone through that loan process, but it's a doozy, right? It definitely takes a long time. I want to say it's like 9 to 10 months of an application process to get through and even unlock those funds. So I think that it's two sides, right? So one, the government needs to figure out how to hire more people and get the right staff in there and come up with an acceleration program so that they can handle the applications that are coming in and how they're going to distribute the funds, because it's an imperative that we spend the money, so there's that. They have different things at their disposal. They can hire, private sector companies to come in and help augment that staff. So that's something that I'm seeing that they're doing. And so then on the other side, from the corporation side, I see companies responding to both sides of what's happening in the government. So there's definitely the carrot and stick kind of thing. There's the regulations that are coming out from the SEC and the EPA. They've released a bunch of stuff around new regulations. I think it was last year the SEC came out with new regulations. And then from the carrot standpoint, they're looking at how they can access some of these funds to enable the infrastructure around the enablement of their sustainability goals. So I think we were kind of talking about that a little bit here on the panel where, so I work sometimes with the corporate VCs and bringing in some of these innovations. They need to be at the stage where they are ready for deployment and scale. So it's more late stage type of investments. And they also need to be able to handle larger scale investments. So that's part of it. And then we're also seeing how the large corporations, not just looking at bringing in new technology, but how are they going to shore up their own technology to further their own targets. And that comes in from looking at how they're going to pay for it internally. So I work with a lot of CSOs that come up with the science around the initiatives. They come up with the roadmap, but then they don't necessarily have the power to implement it. So they team up with maybe a CFO where we dive into the environmental tax around the initiatives that they have in place and look at where we can find some tax incentives that come from like the IRA and that sort of thing, and then being able to fund some of those things through tax credits and incentives. So that's where I'm seeing it kind of playing out. And then there's also a space where I'm watching corporates, similar to what Thurston was saying, around these interesting collaborations that are coming about. That's unprecedented, right? I also wouldn't have believed it, right? Like in my career, I've seen so much change and what I'm seeing in the energy sector, I wouldn't have believed it 5 years ago. I really wouldn't, to see, the type of collaborations that we're seeing, the kind of coming together and investing in new technologies regardless of competition, right? Because they're looking at how do we make the world better so that our companies can do better? And that first piece of it is actually more important than the individual organization.
Thank you. I see Dana standing up, which was my signal that we're supposed to go to audience Q&A, but can I give them all a chance to answer this quickly? All right, go ahead.
So I'll just jump in here. I think we're going to need the perspective of a bit of history and time to understand the full impact. But in just looking at the Inflation Reduction Act alone and what its third of $1 trillion of climate-focused funding by the federal government is going to mean to the acceleration of that incremental 15% reduction, I don't think can be overstated. It is going to be a historical piece of legislation. And when we look back from a perspective of net zero, when we look at from the perspective in the future of the marginal cost per unit of sustainable energy virtually being zero, I think this is going to be, as Winston Churchill, paraphrase him, he said, it's not the end, it's not the beginning of the end, but maybe it's the end of the beginning of being on the bad path on the side of carbon. So from our perspective, we have a government affairs office that monitors all this very closely out of DC, and it's seismic.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Totally agree. One thing I thought was interesting, there's sort of like the CBO estimate of what's going to be spent. This is, making a lot of assumptions about implementation, which needs to happen, and hiring folks. But if you look at some of the other analysis, Credit Suisse, RIP, just put out a great report before they were dissolved, like about 4 or 5 months ago, looking at where they said, which essentially said like, hey, we actually think the CBO, we don't agree with the math. We think it's going to be like 2.5 or 3 times that size because of the uncapped nature of a lot of these tax credits, particularly on green hydrogen, solar supply chain, and just some of the, I think it's right, this seismic change that we don't even understand all of the outputs yet. That analysis said, right now 92% of our solar panels are imported, they thought that in 10 years, 90-ish% of solar panels here would be domestically manufactured, and they might be, exporting to the world. So I think really, really exciting time.
That is exciting. Anybody else want to jump in?
So I'll throw a little bit of cold water on this discussion. Because we're sitting in a university right now, and I've worked with a lot of university researchers and professors in my career, I would say for those of you who are working in a lab and thinking that, wow, there's all this money out there, this is going to be huge, just remember it's a lot easier for the federal government to write a few very large checks than to write, thousands of tiny checks. And so your research project might be great, your startup might be great, and right in the right lane for what you think they want, but the DOE loan office is going to be writing checks that are multi-tens of millions of dollars in size for a single project, and they're not going to probably be looking to support a startup with that. So I think if you've got a startup and you want to tap into these dollars, your better strategy is to find large companies that are going to be getting these big checks for bigger projects and figure out and develop relationships with those large industry players, figure out how your technology can fit into what they're doing, because the vast majority of all this federal funding is going to go to very, very large projects. And so you need to figure out how do you fit into that ecosystem where you may not be in the lead in this project, but you're there supporting with new technology and innovation for some other larger company that's really getting the bulk of the funding.
Thurston, anything quick you want to add?
Yeah, the projects that are going to get funding, and just be clear, the checks are not getting written to Emerson, but for major projects that will be taking place, major solar projects and renewable projects that require that integration into the existing grid, require for a massive modernization of the grid, digitization of the grid. If we're going to all be driving EVs in 10, 15 years, the current grid can't handle it. And so that's where we see opportunity and where we're looking at early stage companies and energy management systems, battery management systems, utility level, grid level battery installations that will allow for that flexibility when the sun isn't shining and the wind's not blowing.
Daniel, do you want to take us to questions?
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple minutes for questions. I saw some students roll in during this discussion, and I want to make sure that they had a chance to ask any questions. So if any students in the room have any questions, want to kick us off. Maya always has questions, and they're very good.
Thank you so much. My name is Maya. I'm a PhD student here in the chemical engineering department, and I'm an aspiring climate tech entrepreneur. The question that I had for you are, do you see, what are the trends in the companies that you are funding in terms of which industries kind of have a lot of supply of climate tech entrepreneurs and also startups? And then where are you seeing there to be a little bit of a dearth, or you wish you saw more, either technologies or startups coming out of certain spaces? Does that make sense?
I would say there's a lot more everywhere, but more specifically, if there's where's there more, there's lots of people providing, that is coming over from general software. So anything that can be sort of generalized. So there's a ton of carbon accounting solutions. There's hundreds of those. Some of those, I think, I wish I had gone to school for chemical engineering. Given my career path, I went for political science. It wasn't as helpful. But I think in those hard to abate spaces, in sustainable aviation fuels and process heat, ammonia production, chemicals and fuels production, steels and cement, I think that's still such a nascent space. Carbon removal, those are exciting and nascent spaces.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, wow, you took the words right out of my mouth. And the nice thing is those are areas, back to what I said before, that here in this region, we actually have, researchers that are working on some really cutting edge things, whether it's in carbon capture or how do you make the chemical industry greener, or metals. Let's look at, the steel industry and how do we abate that hard to abate industry. So I think, there's a lot of good news for researchers and students coming out with your type of degree. I don't know that there's a ton of funding yet for those startups, because I don't think that the investors traditionally have really comes to a staffing issue on their side. They don't have a lot of people, a lot of the funds, maybe these guys do, but there maybe aren't a lot of chemical engineers that are sitting on the investment side of the table who understand what your technology does, as well as how it fits into the industry and how to navigate it through the industry to a point of success. I think we're going to get there. Back to what I said before about investors are specializing. I think this is an area that's ripe for specialization and to bring people with those backgrounds into the investment side. But it's looking better and better all the time.
I'm going to politely disagree.
All right, cool.
So I do think that, just in the sense that they're actually right now probably within kind of specialist climate tech investors, absolutely one of the most interesting spaces is chemical engineering. Because when you think about it, and I'm sure there's lots of other different engineering types here in the room. I'm a mechanical engineer, so please I'm not playing favorites. But when you think about it, like hydrogen, batteries, when you think about the underlying, what are the underlying technologies and the underlying problems we're trying to solve? Trying to take a waste molecule of X, whether it's, carbon capture, and then utilizing that and making it into something useful, whether it's something kind of on the organic or on the kind of fuel side, that is all effectively chemical engineering. And I'd say, my counterpoint to Matt's point is that there are quite a lot of programs within kind of the national labs to help. There's ARPA-E, there's a whole bunch of accelerators that are focused on these types of not just software, hardware, and these are the technologies we need. And now when I was talking about kind of the $94 billion of investment of dollars going into this space, a decent amount of portion of that is now going into these types of startups. People are interested in this because they're realizing that they need to find solutions to some of these problems.
So I'll do a little, I don't think this is countering your counter. I think this may be just adding a little bit on. I mean, one of the problems in those types of startups is that there is a scale-up process that you're going to have to get through before any large company is going to want to work with you. And, I think that's where, luckily, there's seed investors, because hopefully that's where the seed investors are focusing their efforts. And Alicia's speaking from a point of, a fund that could be super useful to these types of entrepreneurs, because it sounds like she has all of those industry partners standing behind her. So I think that's really the key. And back to what I said before, if you're a startup or an entrepreneur in this space, you need to find the investor who fits your field. Look at who their limited partners are. Look at who the people that work for them are, the staff, and make sure you're hooking up with an investor who can really help you get to market. Yes. So I'm glad to hear there are more chemical engineers sitting on this side of the table. I will say that in general venture funds, technology funds, you won't find a lot of those. So you really do have to do your own due diligence on who the investors are and find funds like Alicia's or like Ian's that have the right staff and connections into industry for you.
Daniel?
Hello, I'm Patrick Sullivan. I'm a PhD chemist at UW-Madison, Wisconsin-Madison. I'm just being started for grid energy storage, and this discussion is actually really helpful because this is what my question's about. Is I've been seeing a lot of new deep tech funds, specialized funds popping up, and that's relatively new funds popping up too. And just as Matt was touching on, we're targeting utility scale energy storage. That takes time. Industry moves slow. Supply chains move slow. How does this change the mindset of time periods of returns and exits, type of exits investors are looking for? Thank you.
I'll start off just saying, I don't think that from an investor's perspective, you don't see a big difference in their expectation of timing of returns because they have the constraint of needing to return capital to their investors within a certain period of time, and usually that's a 10-year fund. So they need to make sure that they're getting into investments that can exit within that window. If you're coming to them and speaking to them in year 5 of their fund, they only have 5 years left to get those returns. That being said, most investors know what they're looking for. They target investments that can get them the right type of return in the right timeline. And I think if you're looking at a longer time frame, corporate VCs should have a longer viewpoint. Nonprofit groups should have a longer viewpoint. Philanthropic dollars, of course, all the government dollars, getting the ARPA E awards and things like that, should do all of that. But again, do your due diligence on the VCs before you talk to them and figure out what their timeline is. You can even ask them if you meet with them, what fund are you in? What's the time frame of your fund? How long, are you looking for? And it just may mean that you're a little too early for them to look at that time, but at the same time, you're giving them a preview of what's to come down the road. They may really appreciate that.
I'll jump in real quickly. So kind of splitting it up in a few different buckets. So whether it be deep tech or hard tech that Chrysalix looks at, we generally shy away from that. For 2 reasons. On sort of the deep tech, the quantum computing, the way out there stuff, I kind of put it akin to there's pure scientific research and applied scientific research. And pure scientific research is for the glory of discovery, and we'll see what we come up with. Applied is we have a problem to solve, and we need to figure out what that is. If you take that to the investing corollary, we're far more applied. When we talk to our business units, we do something called Strategic Technology and Innovation Management workshops, where we do scenario planning, road mapping, gap analyses as to where that business sees their customers going, where they plan to meet them in the marketplace in the future, and how does their roadmap get them there. And then that allows us to go back and say, we have gaps A, B, and C. We will now start scanning the early startup ecosystem for those players and see if we can't pick the best one to fill those gaps. So that's kind of how we work on the more proximate technology that could have commercial applications sooner. And as for hard tech, we've actually looked at a couple of things with y'all. I think your blue laser technology, Nibiru, was something we looked at one point. That's a little bit harder. It does have different return profiles. And in some areas where maybe the technology isn't as cutting edge as blue laser welding, we kind of feel like we're Emerson, we're the manufacturing people around the globe, and we have a hard time coming up with investment theses around investing in a widget company. It just has a different return arc, and it has a different working capital requirement.
Daniel?
So maybe just in the name of time, very quick answer on this. Really, kind of it goes back, it's most funds are exactly as these gentlemen are describing, kind of 10-year funds. So you're looking to make sure that you can create a narrative of a return in that time period. There are a few funds, Breakthrough Energy, the Engine, that are kind of longer, 18-year plus funds. It doesn't mean that there are not business models or ways for a startup that's involved in hardware to kind of move rapidly, but it's up to you to really kind of think through what's the business model that you're going to create to make sure that you can get to that return in that time period, and think through that and position that to the investors that you're talking to.
And quick plug for Emerson Ventures, we invest off the balance sheet. We have no time horizons. We can be as patient as we need to be, and we can follow on with investment without having to look at how close we are to the cap of that fund. So just a plug.
Anytime I have to cut a panel off, it's actually a really good thing because this discussion has been super engaging. Let's give a round of applause for this panel. Yeah, thank you to all of you.